Hunger settled over Amara with a crushing, breath-stealing weight that turned the quiet night into a suffocating reminder that even her strength had limits she could no longer hide from. Amara lay on the thin mat that barely softened the hardness of the floor beneath her, and as she stretched out her trembling legs, she felt the sharp, hollow pull of an empty stomach echo through her body, like a slow, agonizing warning. Her breaths came deep and heavy, not because she was tired from the endless work she had done throughout the day, but because hunger had a way of slowing everything inside her, her thoughts, her heartbeat, even the hope she kept trying to hold on to. The servant quarters were silent, except for the faint whisper of night wind squeezing through the cracks in the wooden frame, carrying the scent of cold dust and loneliness, the kind of loneliness that settles deeply in people who feel invisible, even while standing in front of others. The mansion outside cast its golden light across the yard, a soft glow spilling into her cramped room through the small window that seemed to shrink a little more each day. She stared at that glow, letting it blur into shapes that belonged to a world she served with her hands, but was never invited to touch. The chandelier, the polished marble floors, the long dining table where plates overflowed with meals she could never taste. Those images lived behind her eyelids like dreams that didn't belong to her. Tonight, she felt the unfairness more sharply than usual, not because she expected anything different, but because starvation had a way of making even the strongest acceptance fall apart. Her muscles ached from bending, scrubbing, lifting, and walking. Her arms felt heavy, her shoulders tight, and her mind scattered from the pressure of pretending she was fine when nothing about her life allowed comfort. She could still hear the echoes of the raised voices in the kitchen, the hurried footsteps of staff trying to avoid trouble, the tense silence that often filled the woman who raised her with warmth even when their home had been cold, who encouraged her to work hard and believe that dignity didn't depend on wealth. Amara held on to that belief tightly, even now, even in the nights like this when hunger felt stronger than her own willpower. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for miracles, but for just enough strength to reach tomorrow without losing herself in the exhaustion seeping into her bones. The silence around her felt heavier than before, as though the night itself was listening to her struggle. She could hear her own breathing more clearly, slow and uneven, and she wondered why everything felt different tonight. The darkness seemed thicker, the quiet more intense, the room smaller, as if something unseen was drawing closer. She couldn't explain it, but a strange tension moved through the air, soft, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a weight that made her skin prickle. As Amara finally allowed her tired body to relax, the ache in her stomach sharpened once more, and she winced softly, curling slightly on her side. She didn't know how long she lay that way, staring at the faint glow from the mansion and fighting the slow drift of sleep, but eventually, her eyelids grew heavy. She had no way of knowing that somewhere beyond the quiet shadows of the estate, fate had begun moving toward her with a force she could neither see nor predict. She didn't know that the night she feared might break her would soon bring a twist powerful enough to shake the very foundation of her life, and as sleep finally claimed her trembling body, a hunger far greater than her own was slowly, silently approaching. The morning erupted with a cold, explosive tension as Obadiki stepped into his mansion, carrying the kind of simmering fury that could turn even the smallest mistake into a storm no one could outrun. The house staff sensed the shift long before he reached the kitchen. It moved ahead of him like a heat wave, sharp and suffocating, forcing everyone into a tense stillness, as if silence might shield them from whatever had ignited his anger. Amara, still tired from the night of hunger that had barely allowed her moments of real rest, stood near the counter polishing silverware, unaware that the day was about to crush her in a way she could neither anticipate nor defend against. The shattered porcelain bowl lay on the floor, pieces glittering like broken ice across the marble tiles. And though she had not touched it, she understood immediately that someone would be blamed, and that blame rarely traveled upward. Obadiah entered the kitchen with a force that seemed too large for the room, his gaze sweeping over the pieces of his antique bowl. The one he claimed represented legacy, status, and years of collected prestige. Rage consumed his composure in an instant, and the atmosphere tightened until it felt like there wasn't enough space for anyone to breathe. His voice rose, not as a question, but as an accusation already formed in his mind, shaped by impatience and an ego accustomed to obedience. He didn't request an explanation. He demanded guilt. He demanded responsibility. And without allowing a single second for truth to find its place, he turned sharply toward Amara. His words struck her with a force that left her momentarily frozen, the accusation so sudden and so heavy that she could hardly understand how quickly she had become the target of his fury. She tried to speak, tried to explain that she had not even entered the kitchen during the night, that she had spent the evening struggling with her hunger and preparing herself for another long day of labor. But her voice trembled so softly, it could barely reach the distance between them. Her courage faltered under the weight of his glare. She knew he wasn't listening. The powerful rarely listened to those whose lives depended on their mercy. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribcage as she attempted to steady herself, the dizziness from her hunger weaving through her thoughts, making everything feel slightly blurred around the edges. She understood that pleading would change nothing. He had already decided. He needed someone to absorb the frustration boiling inside him, and she was the easiest target, quiet, poor, and replaceable in his eyes. The realization stung deeper than the accusation itself, because she had worked faithfully, respectfully, and tirelessly, yet none of it had earned her the smallest protection from his anger. With a sharp gesture, cold enough to slice through whatever dignity she had left, he fired her, so quickly, so effortlessly, as though her months of service were nothing more than dust swept from the floor. His decision left her standing there hollow and stunned, each word sinking into her with a heaviness that made her feel smaller than she had ever felt before. The guard stepped in without hesitation. She was given no moment to gather her few belongings, no opportunity to salvage even the little items that had made her room feel like something resembling a life. They escorted her through the hallway, while the other staff members watched in silence, some with pity, others with fear, because they knew how swiftly power could erase a person's place. The walk out of the mansion felt longer than the years she had spent working inside it. Her chest tightened with humiliation, her eyes burning from emotions she refused to let spill in front of those who believed she had earned her disgrace. She stepped outside with empty hands, her body weakened from hunger, and her spirit trembling beneath the weight of unjust dismissal. The fresh air hit her face, like a cold reminder that her life had shifted in a single, unforgiving moment. She walked away slowly, each step heavy with uncertainty, replaying the morning again and again in her mind as she wondered how one man's unchecked anger had so easily destroyed her livelihood. Yet beneath her sorrow, something else lingered. A quiet, unseen movement of fate rising around her, like a breeze preparing to turn directions. What she didn't realize was that the man who had cast her aside so mercilessly was already drifting toward a downfall he could not escape on his own. She had no idea that the hunger clawing at her would soon mirror a far more desperate hunger rising inside the billionaire who believed he didn't need her. And as she walked farther from the mansion, unaware of what waited ahead, destiny followed behind her with silent, determined steps. The long, dusty village road stretched before Amara like an unforgiving witness to her despair, echoing every silent fear rising inside her, as she walked with a heaviness she could no longer hide. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a weary orange glow across the landscape as Amara moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, each one feeling heavier than the last as if the road itself were testing the limits of her endurance. The humiliation of the morning still clung to her skin like an unwelcome second layer, making her feel exposed and smaller with every mile. She wrapped her arms around herself not just to hold back the ache twisting through her stomach, but to keep the weight of her emotions from spilling into the open air, where she feared they might finally break her. The world around her felt wide, yet suffocating, a contrast she could not escape, reminding her that the only direction she could go was forward, even if each step felt uncertain. The quiet countryside seemed to observe her in a way that made her chest tighten, as though every tree and stone understood the depth of her struggle without offering a single moment of relief. She knew she could not return home yet, not with the news that she had lost her job and the income her mother relied on, not with the memory of Obadiki's cold dismissal still burning in her mind. Shame wrapped around her, like the stickiness of the humid air, pressing down on her shoulders until it felt almost unbearable. The thought of her mother's gentle eyes filled with worry made Amara hesitate, and she paused briefly on the side of the road, steadying her breath before forcing her tired legs to carry her farther. Hunger pulsed through her again, sharper this time, sending a slow wave of weakness up her spine that made her sway for a moment. She pressed a hand to her stomach, hoping the pressure would dull the ache, but it did little more than remind her of how long it had been since she tasted food. Nearly 2 days had passed since her last small meal, and though she tried to remain composed, her body betrayed her with a faint tremble she could feel in her fingers. She inhaled deeply, pushing through the discomfort with a determination that came not from strength, but from necessity. Because stopping meant surrender, and surrender was something she had never learned how to accept. The world around her felt unusually still, as if even the wind had paused to watch her struggle. The fields stretched out on either side of the road in silence, their calmness almost mocking compared to the turmoil swirling inside her. Still, she kept walking, and with every step, she searched for reasons to believe that her suffering was not in vain. She whispered small prayers between breaths, asking for clarity, for opportunity, for a moment of grace that might allow her to recalibrate her life before hunger consumed her entirely. She tried to find comfort in the rhythm of her footsteps, the steady crunch of gravel beneath her worn shoes, but nothing eased the heaviness inside her. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, blinking back the dizziness that blurred the edges of her vision. Even in her weakness, there was a quiet determination shaping her movements, a stubbornness born from survival rather than pride. She reminded herself that life had pushed her down before, and each time she had found a way to rise again. This moment, painful as it was, would be no different. Somewhere within her, she believed that a shift was coming, something unexpected, something that would make sense of the weight she carried. But the road remained quiet, stretching endlessly into an uncertain future as she pushed forward with slow, steady breaths. She did not look back because she saw no reason to. There was nothing behind her she wished to return to. Yet, if she had turned even once, she might have noticed the faint trace of movement in the distance, a glimmer of metal catching the late afternoon light. She kept walking, unaware of the thread of fate weaving itself closer to her path with every second. The quiet landscape around her seemed almost too calm, too watchful, as though it understood more than it revealed. She felt alone, but she was not. Something was shifting, something she could not see, something carrying a force as unexpected as the moment she lost her job. Behind her, an expensive engine sputtered and coughed with a violent tremor, its final breath escaping into the dusty air before falling into complete silence. She didn't turn, didn't notice, didn't feel the pull of destiny tightening behind her like a shadow preparing to touch her life again. And without knowing it, she kept walking straight into the moment that would change everything. For the first time in years, Obadiki felt real fear clamp around his chest as his luxury car shuddered, coughed, and rolled into a dead, breathless silence in the middle of a deserted forest road. The engine failure was so sudden that for a moment he simply stared at the dashboard, convinced it was impossible for a machine this expensive, this meticulously maintained, to fail him without warning. But when he tried the ignition again and heard nothing, not even a reluctant whine of resistance, not a flicker of life on the display, something cold and unfamiliar slipped into his gut. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the suffocating stillness of the forest road. The air, thick with heat, and the subtle hum of distant insects that paid no attention to his rising panic. The world around him felt strangely indifferent, as if nature itself did not care who he was or how much power he carried in the city beyond the trees. He opened the hood, checking the engine with the frantic urgency of a man trying to hold on to the illusion of control. But the machinery looked perfectly intact, mocking him with its stillness. He checked his dashboard lights, the battery indicator, even the fuse compartment, yet nothing explained the sudden collapse. For the first time in far too long, he realized he had absolutely no solution, no tool, no resource that could rescue him at this moment. When he reached for his phone, hoping at least for direction or assistance, the black screen stared back at him with the finality of a closed door. The battery had died hours earlier, drained by constant calls, messages, and meetings that filled every minute of his life. Meetings he had chosen over meals, over rest, over basic human needs. And then hunger hit him, not gently, not gradually, but with the force of a sharp, sudden blow that left him momentarily stunned. He realized he had rushed through his morning with only coffee, had skipped lunch entirely, and had pushed dinner to later because he had convinced himself that work deserved priority. Now that arrogance pulsed through him like a hollow ache, wrapping its fingers around his ribs and making him sway as he tried to steady himself. He took a long breath, forcing himself to remain upright, but the heat from the afternoon sun pressed against him relentlessly, draining his strength with a slow, merciless consistency. Minutes stretched into hours, and with each passing moment, the sun seemed to burn hotter, the air heavier, the silence louder. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck and along his temples until it dripped down in thin, salty lines. His shirt clung tightly to his back, dampening with the discomfort of humidity and fatigue. His throat began to dry, the lack of water turning every swallow into a reminder that he had taken too much for granted. He tried pacing, then stopping, then leaning against the car for support. But nothing eased the dizziness creeping steadily through his vision. The world around him blurred slightly at the edges, shifting in and out of focus as hunger clawed deeper into his body. He attempted to walk in one direction, thinking he might find help a mile or two away, but his legs felt strangely disconnected from his mind, moving without strength and landing shakily on the dusty ground beneath him. He realized the truth slowly, almost painfully. Despite all his wealth, all his influence, all his power, he had never felt more helpless than he did in that moment. The forest did not care about his status, the road did not care about his reputation, and the sun certainly did not care about the titles people used when addressing him. Out here, stripped of the tools that made him untouchable, he was simply a man too weak to outrun the consequences of his own choices. His breathing grew heavier as the dizziness intensified, and he blinked several times, struggling to keep the world from spinning. The road stretched endlessly before him, lonely and indifferent, offering no sign of help or movement. He pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to steady himself once more, but the effort only deepened the blur clouding his vision. And then, through the haze, something shifted, something small, distant, but undeniably human. He narrowed his eyes, forcing his fading focus to lock onto the silhouette ahead. The figure walking slowly along the dusty road seemed almost unreal at first, a shape caught between shadow and light. But as his vision sharpened for a brief moment, recognition struck him with startling clarity. The person ahead was someone he never expected to see here, someone whose life he had broken just hours earlier. Obadic's voice broke with a raw, desperate tremor as he called out to the one person whose forgiveness he knew he had no right to expect, yet whose presence he needed more than his pride could bear. Amara stopped mid-stride, her breath caught halfway between disbelief and instinctive caution as the familiar voice drifted toward her, strained and trembling in a way she had never heard before. Slowly, she turned, and the sight that met her eyes forced her heart into a tight, confused rhythm. Obadiki, her employer, the man who had dismissed her without hesitation only hours earlier, was stumbling toward her with a frailty that did not belong to the powerful figure she had always known. His steps dragged unevenly across the dusty road, his once commanding posture stripped away and replaced by a fragile, frightened weakness that made him look like a man pushed far past his breaking point. For a moment, she wondered if the heat was playing tricks on her, if hunger and exhaustion were weaving illusions in the air. But the closer he came, the more undeniable the truth became. His clothes were drenched with sweat, his hands shook as he reached out to steady himself, and his eyes carried a haunted desperation that struck her with a force she could not explain. This was not the man who had ordered guards to throw her out, not the man who dismissed her as though her life held no weight. This was someone stripped bare by circumstance, someone whose silence and pride had collapsed under the weight of a hunger he did not know how to endure. She remained frozen where she stood, torn between pity she did not want to feel and the sharp sting of humiliation that still lingered from the morning. Her heart raced, not just from shock, but from a strange, unsettling sense that the world had shifted in a way she could not fully understand. Part of her wanted to turn away and let him face the consequences of his own choices. Yet another part, quiet, compassionate, unwilling to abandon a suffering human being, held her still. She hated that kindness still lived inside her, even when he had not shown her a fraction of it. When he said her name again, the sound carried none of the authority he once wielded so easily. It came out soft, trembling, and painfully unsteady, as though the syllables themselves were too heavy for him to lift. She had never heard her name spoken like that by him, without command, without power, without the cold detachment that had always marked their interactions. Instead, there was a plea woven into the word, a quiet acknowledgement of guilt, desperation, and vulnerability he could no longer hide. Amara's fingers tightened around the small cloth bag hanging at her side as a wave of conflicting emotions surged inside her. She remembered the humiliation, the dismissal, the disregard. She remembered how he refused to listen when she tried to defend herself. She remembered the look of cold certainty in his eyes when he stripped her of her place. But now those same eyes held something entirely different: fear, exhaustion, and a quiet, almost childlike hope that she might not turn away from him. Her gaze traveled over him slowly, taking in the shaking in his hands, the uneven rise and fall of his breath, the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. She realized then that whatever anger or pride had fueled him earlier had long since drained away, leaving behind a man who was, for the first time, forced to face the limits of his own humanity. It unsettled her, not because she wished him harm, but because she had never imagined seeing such vulnerability in someone who had always looked untouchable. The road around them seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching long and tense as if the world itself was waiting to witness how this moment would unfold. The sunlight dimmed slightly as a cloud passed overhead, casting a shadow across his face that only deepened the contrast between the man he had been and the man he had become within a few cruel hours. Amara took a slow breath, unsure whether she was more rattled by his weakness or by the strange pull of destiny that had brought them back to each other so quickly, so unexpectedly. Obadic stopped a few steps away from her, swaying slightly as he struggled to gather enough strength to speak. His lips parted, trembling with effort, and she could see how much it cost him to form words through the weight of hunger and regret pressing into him. With his voice barely steady, he lifted his eyes to hers and whispered 4 fragile words that made the world around her tilt in stunned disbelief. In that instant, every breath she took felt suspended in the thick, trembling silence between them. And before she could comprehend what he had asked, fate pushed them both into a moment neither of them was prepared to face. The world seemed to shift off its axis as a man accustomed to command lowered his pride before a former maid and begged not for forgiveness, not for mercy, but for the simplest, most human necessity, food. Amara stared at Obadika with a stunned stillness that rooted her to the dusty road, unable to reconcile the fragile, trembling man standing before her with the cold authority that had once dominated the mansion she had served. His clothes clung to him with the dampness of exhaustion, his breath uneven as he forced himself to remain upright, and the shadows under his eyes revealed a truth he could not hide, even if he tried. The arrogance she remembered had evaporated beneath the weight of fear and hunger, leaving behind a man stripped of the power that once made him untouchable. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words dissolved briefly before forming, as though the admission itself was too heavy to push through. When he finally managed to speak, his voice broke with a weariness that carried more honesty than she had ever heard from him. He confessed he had not eaten in nearly 20 hours, each syllable carrying the weight of discomfort he had tried so long to ignore. His throat tightened as he admitted he was too weak to walk much farther, that his car had failed him, that his phone was dead, and that the privilege he wore like a second skin had offered him nothing out here. His vulnerability exposed itself with every slow breath he took, each one seeming to emphasize how unprepared he was for the sharpness of hunger that cut through him like a punishment he didn't know how to endure. Amara felt the ground beneath her shift in a quiet, unsettling way. The memory of his cruelty from that morning rose inside her with a sharp clarity, reminding her of the humiliation he had forced upon her without a moment's hesitation. She remembered standing in the kitchen with fear twisting in her stomach as he dismissed her with the wave of a hand, refusing to listen, refusing to acknowledge her truth. The sting of that memory still lived in her chest, and for a fleeting moment she felt the phantom weight of the cold injustice she had carried for hours. Yet beneath all of that, a different force stirred. Something gentler, something human, something she could not silence no matter how deeply she tried to bury it. Compassion tugged at her heart with a persistence she didn't want to feel, reminding her that cruelty, no matter how painful, could not reshape the core of who she was. She had never been the kind of person who turned away from suffering, not even when the one suffering had pushed her away. She hated that she felt this softness now, hated that fate had placed her in a position where helping him felt both wrong and inevitable. Her hand moved instinctively toward the small cloth bag at her side, and her heart tightened when she remembered what was inside. A handful of dry gari, just enough to give her the strength to reach the village, just enough to keep her from collapsing under the weight of hunger that had followed her for 2 days. It was supposed to be her first real meal since dawn, yesterday, a small promise of relief she had been clinging to as she walked the long road with trembling legs. The idea of giving even a portion of it away felt impossible, almost painful, as though she would be surrendering the little hope she had left. She hesitated, her fingers lingering over the fabric, and she looked at Obadike again. The conflict inside her deepened, stretching through her like a tug-of-war between pride and compassion. He met her gaze with eyes that held none of the certainty he once carried, only exhaustion, regret, and a silent plea he did not know how to speak properly. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself against the rising storm of emotion within her, a storm that was not born from anger alone, but from the confusing tenderness of seeing someone she once feared, now trembling, like a man stripped of every illusion of power. The road remained quiet around them, the late afternoon light softening as the day inched toward evening, casting long shadows over their uncertain moment. Amara felt the tension thickening the air, as if time itself had paused to witness the decision she was about to make. She no longer saw a billionaire before her, only a human being brought to his knees by the simplest need. And though the wound he left in her had not healed, something inside her refused to let another person collapse when she had the power to prevent it. Her breath steadied as the choice settled in her heart. With trembling fingers, she reached slowly into her bag, feeling the weight of the moment press tightly against her chest. She knew that whatever she decided now would reshape the fragile line connecting their lives. And as her hand closed around the dry Gary meant for her survival, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which instinct she would obey. A quiet heaviness settled between them as Amara set down the only food she had left in the world before the very man who once denied her even the smallest dignity of a meal. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dry Gary lay in the small plastic container like a fragile offering, humble and simple, yet carrying more weight than any feast could ever hold. Amara's hands trembled slightly as she poured the last of her water over it, watching the grains swell slowly as though absorbing not just the liquid, but the exhaustion, bitterness, and reluctant compassion woven through the moment. She knew this meal was meant for her, the one thing standing between her and collapse, yet she found herself setting it before him with a calmness she did not understand. The air felt dense around them, as if fate itself leaned closer to witness the choice stretching the boundary of her own survival. Obadiah's eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and shame as he stared at the container. His jaw tightened, his breath uneven, and for the first time in his life, he seemed unsure whether he had the right to accept the kindness of someone he had wounded so deeply. He hesitated, not because he lacked hunger, his body screamed for nourishment, but because he felt the weight of what it meant for a man like him to be fed by a woman he had cast aside without thought. The conflict within him showed in the tremor of his fingers, in the way his gaze dropped briefly to the ground, as if he could not bear the truth of his own weakness. But hunger has a way of stripping away the layers people hide behind. Pride, so carefully built, so fiercely guarded, crumbled almost instantly beneath the harsh demand of a starving body. With a slow, unsure motion, he reached for the container, his hands shaking as he lifted the first small spoonful to his mouth. The moment the food touched his tongue, something inside him broke open. Each bite was sharp with humility, coated with guilt, threaded with gratitude he did not know how to voice. The Gary was simple, barely flavored, but to him it felt like mercy and punishment blended into a single moment, reminding him how cruelly he had behaved and how unexpectedly life had turned its lesson back toward him. Amara watched silently, her expression steady, yet heavy with everything she could not untangle. She felt no triumph at seeing him vulnerable, no satisfaction in offering him what little she had left. Instead, she felt a deep, silent ache, as though the moment had reached inside her and stirred emotions she had spent years trying to bury. She did not want to pity him, but pity crept in through cracks she did not know existed. She did not want to care, but care whispered quietly inside her chest, reminding her that she could not unlearn empathy, even when she wished she could. His suffering did not erase what he had done, but it softened something inside her that she could not ignore. The road around them stayed perfectly still, as if the world itself understood the sacred tension unfolding between two people caught in a twist neither of them had chosen. The breeze slowed, the hum of the distant forest dimmed, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dust, shadows that seemed to merge their fates more tightly than either expected. Amara tightened her grip on her bag, fighting the rising knot in her throat as she watched him swallow the last spoonful with a quiet desperation that made her heart tremble. When he finally lowered the container, he did not look up immediately. His shoulders rose and fell with the weight of breaths he had been holding for too long, and when he did lift his eyes to meet hers, she saw something entirely new in them. Vulnerability, yes, but also a raw, unguarded honesty that stripped him of every layer of control he had ever worn. There was gratitude there, and regret, and an echo of something like remorse settling deeper than words could reach. He opened his mouth slightly, the silence between them stretching thin as though the moment itself waited for the truth he was about to release. His lips trembled, his voice hesitant. His expression carrying the weight of a confession he never imagined he would need to make. Then, with a fragile breath, he spoke words that cracked through the stillness with the force of a confession, long overdue. The sound of them lingered in the air, like distant thunder rolling across an open sky. And in that moment, Amara felt her entire world tilt, knowing nothing between them would remain the same after what he had just said. Humility threaded itself through Obadiki's voice with a trembling sincerity as he apologized, not from the height of power he once stood on, but from the raw, aching pain of a man finally seeing the damage he had caused. For a moment after he spoke, the world around them felt strangely suspended, as if every sound of rustling leaves and distant wind had quieted to give space to the confession he had held back for far too long. Obadik's shoulders sagged under the weight of his truth, his eyes lowered not in defeat, but in a stark, unfiltered acknowledgement of the person he had allowed himself to become. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself before lifting his gaze enough to meet hers, and in that brief connection, there was no trace of the arrogance she had come to fear, only a deep, trembling remorse that reached toward her, like a fragile plea for understanding. He told her he had treated her with a carelessness he could no longer justify, his voice strained by the sharp edges of guilt that had lodged themselves inside him since the moment he realized how cruelly he had stripped her of her dignity. He admitted that he had been blinded by ego, distracted by wealth, and consumed by a sense of invincibility that left no room for compassion. Each word he spoke seemed to pull another layer of armor away from him, leaving him exposed in a way she never believed she would witness. He confessed that the memory of her being pushed out of his mansion with nothing, no explanation, no belongings, no respect, had replayed inside him like a wound he could not escape. Amara listened, her breath steady but guarded, her expression calm yet unreadable as she absorbed the honesty pouring out of her. She didn't interrupt. She didn't respond. She didn't shift even a little. She simply stood still, allowing the silence between them to stretch long and heavy, creating her quietness of ignoring the humanity of those around him. He whispered that he wished he could undo the hurt he caused her, that he wished he had listened, that he wished he had seen her not as a maid, but as a person deserving of dignity and consideration. Amara's eyes softened for a brief moment, though she kept her face composed, refusing to let emotion rush ahead of reason. She did not fully trust his remorse yet. The wound of his actions was still fresh, still lodged within her, like a bruise that had not finished darkening. She needed more than words. She needed sincerity that did not vanish when comfort returned to him. She needed to know that this apology wasn't a momentary vulnerability born of desperation, but the beginning of a change that would last beyond the hunger driving him now. Her silence pressed on him with a weight he could feel deep in his chest, forcing him to confront the truth of who he had been, who he was now, and who he hoped he could become. He waited for her to speak, but she did not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the power of letting a man sit fully inside the gravity of his own regret. The soft breeze moved between them, lifting the dust lightly from the road, as if carrying away pieces of the emptiness that had once filled the space around them. Amara lifted her chin slightly, her eyes steady, her presence grounded enough to make even the silence feel purposeful. Obadike swallowed hard, and in that stillness, something shifted inside him. A clarity, a decision, a plea he knew might change everything. He stepped a little closer, his voice dropping with a quiet intensity. Then he made a request she never imagined would come from the same man who once dismissed her without a second thought. The words formed slowly, trembling with fear and hope in equal measure, pushing the air between them into a fragile tension. And as the meaning settled over her, Amara felt the ground beneath her shift, realizing the moment ahead would test both of them far more deeply than hunger ever had. For the first time in his life, Obadike spoke not with authority, but with humility, as he asked Amara, not commanded her, for the chance to mend the harm he had caused. Amara felt the weight of his request settle deeply into her chest, stirring emotions she had tried to keep contained since the moment fate placed them back into each other's lives. His words hung in the still air between them, heavy with sincerity, yet carrying the fragility of a man afraid of being denied. She watched him carefully, her gaze steady, as he explained that he wished to repay every withheld salary and offer her a role far different from the one he had once forced her into, a position built not on servitude, but on dignity and mutual respect. It was an unexpected shift, one she never imagined would come from someone who had always moved through the world, convinced that people existed to meet his demands. He took a slow breath before continuing, his voice roughened by hunger and the vulnerability of confession. He told her he needed guidance, not in business or wealth, but in becoming a better version of himself, a man who understood the weight of his actions, a man who could treat others with the humanity he had long ignored. His eyes didn't carry the commanding sharpness she once feared. Instead, they held a quiet plea, an uncertain hope that she might believe he was capable of change if someone showed him how to begin. The request was startling, not because it was grand, but because it was honest, an honesty that stripped away the layers of power he had always hidden behind. Amara inhaled deeply, letting the cool air steady the tangle of emotions rising inside her. She had endured humiliation at his hands, nights of hunger, and a dismissal that made her question her own worth. Forgiving him was not something she could hand over easily, nor something she wished to rush under the pressure of the moment. She met his gaze with a calm strength that seemed to slow the world around them, and she told him, quietly, firmly, that forgiveness was not a gift to be handed out like payment or apology. Forgiveness, she said, was a journey walked through actions, consistency, and genuine transformation, not promises spoken in vulnerability or desperation. Her words struck him with a clarity that made him bow his head slightly, absorbing the truth with a humility she had never witnessed in him. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded, accepting that her forgiveness would not be immediate, accepting that he needed to earn it, accepting that change demanded far more than intention. It demanded commitment, patience, and accountability. His nod carried a quiet surrender, not the kind born from weakness, but the kind shaped by the realization that becoming better required losing the version of himself he once believed was untouchable. The road around them was wrapped in a soft stillness, as if the forest itself was listening to their exchange, with a reverence that matched the gravity of the moment. Amara's heart steadied slightly, no longer racing with the shock of seeing him weak, no longer trembling with the bitterness she carried through the morning. Instead, she felt a shift, a small hesitant release inside her that did not erase the hurt, but allowed space for possibility. She didn't offer forgiveness, not yet, but she offered truth, and sometimes truth was the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. Obadike lifted his head again, searching her expression for a clue, a signal, anything that might help him understand where he stood in her eyes. But she kept her face calm, composed, allowing him to sit inside the uncertainty of this new beginning. The quiet between them wasn't hostile now. It was reflective, a space where growth could begin or crumble depending on what came next. She didn't speak, and he didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, they stood there, suspended in the delicate balance between what had been and what could be. It was in that fragile quiet, just as something unspoken began to settle between them, that nature itself seemed to shift, reminding them that their moment was far from protected. Before either of them could say another word, the forest around them erupted with a sudden rustling that broke through the silence like a warning tearing through the still air. The sound grew louder, urgent, as though something unseen was approaching with unfamiliar force, and in an instant, both of them turned toward the trees, their breath catching as the shadows began to move. Darkness folded itself over the lonely forest road with a suffocating stillness, turning every shifting shadow into a potential danger as Amara guided Obedika toward the shelter of the towering Iroko tree. Night arrived faster than either of them expected, drawing a thick veil across the sky until the last traces of daylight vanished, leaving only the dim glow of the moon to sketch faint outlines of trees around them. Amara steadied herself as she helped Obedika settle beneath the massive trunk, her hands firm despite the tremor of her own exhaustion. The cool bark pressed against his back, and though he tried to mask it, she could feel the weakness in his body as he lowered himself with a slow, unsteady breath. For a moment, the silence between them felt like a fragile shield, as if speaking too loudly might break the thin thread of calm that held the night in place. But the illusion did not last long. From within the thicket, strange animal calls rose and faded unpredictably, long, haunting sounds that traveled across the forest floor and tightened every muscle in Amara's body. She kept her gaze steady, forcing herself not to react visibly, yet she could not stop the small shiver that danced across her spine. Her senses sharpened, attuned to the faintest rustle, the softest crackle of dried leaves, the distant sweep of wings brushing through branches. Fear pressed into her skin, but beside her sat a man whose hunger had stolen his strength, leaving her no choice but to remain alert for both of them. As minutes stretched into long, quiet pockets of time, they began to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, but in soft, subdued tones that slipped into the night like confessions neither of them expected to share. Amara spoke of her mother's hopes, the sacrifices she had made, the silent pride she carried despite their hardships. Obidik listened intently, his face shadowed but his attention unwavering, as if every word she offered carved a deeper understanding inside him. In return, he shared pieces of his childhood, fragments of a life that looked polished from the outside but carried its own cracks. Loneliness disguised beneath success, pressure masked behind wealth, a fear of vulnerability hidden under authority. Their conversation shifted slowly, revealing truths normally kept locked away. For the first time, they met each other without the walls built by job titles, expectations, or power. Here, beneath the Iroko tree, they were simply two human beings trying to navigate a moment shaped by fate and stripped of privilege. Amara realized that the emptiness in Obediki's voice was not only hunger, but also the lingering echo of guilt he carried for too long, without admitting. And Obedika, watching the quiet resilience in her posture, saw a strength he had underestimated, an inner steadiness unshaken by poverty or mistreatment. The night air thickened gradually, cooling as the moon climbed higher. A faint breeze passed over them, lifting the ends of Amara's scarf and carrying the earthy scent of the forest. She pulled her knees close, feeling the cold settle into her bones but refusing to let it show. Obediki shifted slightly, trying to sit more upright, though every movement cost him effort he could barely muster. She noticed the strain in his expression and placed a steadying hand near him, not touching him directly, but close enough to let him know he wasn't alone. For a rare moment, silence did not feel heavy. It felt shared. It felt like a bridge. But the forest was not finished testing them. Somewhere behind the thick clusters of trees, a soft rustle broke through the calm, faint at first, almost like the whisper of grass bending under a light footstep. Amara turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to determine whether the sound belonged to animal or human. Before she could decide, another noise followed, heavier this time, more deliberate, carrying a subtle weight that traveled through the ground in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Obadiah stiffened beside her, his breath pausing mid-sigh as both of them turned toward the deeper darkness spreading behind the trees. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, the air too still, as though everything had paused to make room for whatever approached. Then, from the thick shadows behind the iroko tree, footsteps emerged, slow, measured, and unmistakably human. Each step grew clearer, pressing closer through the darkness with an eerie steadiness neither of them could ignore. And as the figure moved toward them, Amara felt her heartbeat quicken, knowing this moment could change the night in ways neither of them were prepared to face. Just when fear threatened to close in around them, a warm lantern glow sliced through the suffocating darkness, like a quiet promise that the night had not come to claim them after all. The footsteps that had stirred unease now carried a different weight, and as the soft golden light pushed through the thick shadows, Amara felt her breath release in a slow, shaky exhale she hadn't realized she was holding. From the trees emerged a small group of hunters, their faces worn by long hours in the forest, yet softened instantly by recognition when their lantern beams settled on Amara. Relief washed over them as they called her name, stepping forward, with the steady familiarity of men who had known her family for years. The tension that had gripped her shoulders eased slightly, replaced by a gentle reassurance that she and Obadiah were no longer alone on the unforgiving road. The hunters approached with a respectful urgency, their movements purposeful and calm as they assessed the weary figure slumped beneath the iroko tree. They asked no unnecessary questions, needing only one glance at Obadiah's weakened posture to understand the severity of his condition. One of them uncorked a small gourd and offered it to him, the cool water catching the lantern light as it touched his lips. Obadiah drank slowly, cautiously, as though every swallow required strength he wasn't sure he still possessed. His chest rose and fell with deliberate steadiness, the hint of life returning to his expression in fragile increments. Amara watched quietly as the hunters supported him, helping him lean forward and steady his breathing. It felt strange to see strangers offer him assistance with a tenderness he had never allowed others to extend to him. Strange to witness how easily humanity eclipsed the rigid distance of status and wealth. There was no judgment in their eyes, only an instinctive empathy for a man who was visibly at the edge of collapse. The forest felt less threatening now, its shadows softened by the glow of the lanterns reflecting off branches and leaves, creating a mosaic of light that seemed almost protective. A few minutes passed before the distant rumble of an engine broke through the stillness, rising steadily until headlights sliced through the darkness. Obadiah's security team spilled out of the SUV in frantic urgency, their voices shaken with worry as they hurried toward him. The contrast between the frantic team and the calm hunters painted a vivid picture of two worlds colliding in the dim forest light. The world of wealth, accustomed to control, and the world of ordinary people who stepped in simply because it was right. The team hovered around him, checking his vitals, supporting his arms, and guiding him toward the vehicle in a bustle of concern that made Amara take a step back out of instinct. But before they helped him inside, Obadiah turned toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though the moment required a care that words alone could not capture. He reached out gently, taking her hand with a quietness that caught her off guard. His fingers were still trembling, but the gesture carried a sincerity she could feel through the dust and fatigue clinging to both of them. He didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he felt lived too deeply in the silence between them. Gratitude, apology, and something unspoken lingered in the way he looked at her, creating a moment that felt too fragile to break. Amara held still, allowing the moment to exist without rushing it, without filling it with questions she wasn't ready to ask. She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't hold on to his either. She simply allowed the weight of the gesture to settle between them like a quiet acknowledgement of the strange, unexpected bond fate had woven around their lives. When he finally released her hand and stepped toward the security vehicle, she took a single step back, her heart carrying a mixture of uncertainty and reflection as the SUV door closed behind him. The lanterns dimmed slightly as the hunters began gathering their things, their voices fading into the sounds of the night. Amara watched the SUV pull away, its taillights glowing briefly before disappearing into the darkness, leaving the forest quiet once more. She walked home slowly that night, still unsure where any of this would lead, still wondering why her heart felt heavier now that he was safe. 2 days later, as she swept the small yard outside her mother's hut, the distant roar of an engine stirred the still air around her. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of their compound, its polished surface catching the morning sun. And when the door opened, Amara froze, realizing the visitor stepping out was the last person she expected to see again so soon. Obadiki stepped out of the black SUV with the quiet humility of a man who had walked through fire and emerged stripped of pride, but strengthened by the kind of clarity only suffering can carve into a person's soul. The morning sun washed gently over the small compound as Amara stood frozen, watching him approach with a steadiness she did not recognize from the man who once commanded rooms with cold authority. His posture was different now, no sharpness, no arrogance, no imposing weight of power, only a quiet reverence that softened the very air around him. Her mother stepped out of the hut with the instinctive warmth of a woman who had learned to read people long before they spoke, and she greeted him with a calm, respectful nod. He bowed slightly in return, lowering himself in a gesture that spoke louder than any rehearsed apology ever could. It was the first sign that he had come not as a savior, not as a benefactor, but as a man seeking genuine reconciliation. He requested to speak with the family, and Amira's mother guided them toward the shaded bench near the neem tree. The air settled into a patient stillness as they sat, the sounds of the village carrying softly in the background, the distant call of a cellar, the rustle of leaves, the slow rhythm of morning chores. Obidike inhaled deeply, preparing his words with the respect of a man who understood that apologies must be crafted with honesty rather than convenience. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the trembling desperation from the forest, but instead a steady earnestness shaped by reflection. He apologized formally, taking responsibility without deflecting blame, admitting each of the ways he had wronged Amara, from ignoring her truth, to dismissing her dignity, to pushing her out into a world with no concern for her safety or survival. Her mother listened with an attentive calm, her eyes narrowing only when she sensed his remorse deepen into something layered and sincere. He spoke of the lessons the past days had carved into him, lessons that stripped away the illusions he had worn for years and revealed the emptiness beneath the surface of wealth. He explained how the moment Amara fed him had cracked something inside him, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he had long refused to acknowledge. His words were not perfect, but they carried the weight of truth and the tremble of a man willing to rebuild a life with humility rather than power. Then, with careful deliberation, he offered Amara a new beginning, not as an act of repayment and not as a gesture of charity, but as an opportunity built on respect and recognition. He proposed to fund her education, help her secure stable housing, and provide her with a position that aligned with her dignity, her aspirations, and her strengths. The offer did not carry the tone of superiority. It carried the tone of a man trying to restore something he had broken, a man determined to value someone he had once underestimated. Amara listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind weaving through the emotions threading through her. She knew the decision ahead was not one to make lightly. Forgiveness required not only reflection, but courage. But as she watched the sincerity in his posture, the stillness in his eyes, and the humility in his words, she recognized something unmistakable, a true shift in his heart, a change not born from convenience or fear, but from understanding. She accepted, not because of the offer itself, but because she saw the rare sincerity that few people manage to reach without being transformed by hardship. Her mother smiled softly, lifting her hand to offer a blessing that drifted into the morning with a warmth that softened the edges of everything around them. She thanked him for acknowledging his faults and for choosing to rise above them. She thanked Amara for her resilience, and she thanked destiny for the strange, unexpected journey that had brought two broken moments together to form something unexpectedly whole. Obidic stepped back toward the SUV beside Amara, and as they prepared to leave, there was a quiet, grounded sense of possibility between them. Not a promise, not a certainty, but a beginning shaped by humility and hope. But as the road stretched ahead of them and the village slowly disappeared behind the turning vehicle, none of them realized that this fragile moment of forgiveness was only the first step into a much larger story, waiting beyond the horizon. The weight of new beginnings pressed softly through the silence, carrying questions neither of them yet knew how to ask. And as the car rolled forward, destiny followed closely behind, ready to test them in ways more profound than hunger ever had. If stories like this, stories like Speak to Your Heart, stay with us by subscribing, so you never miss the journeys that remind us how strength, dignity, and fate shape real lives in unforgettable ways. Share your thoughts below. Your voice gives life to these stories and guides the ones we create next. And if this narrative touched you, turn on notifications so each new chapter finds you the moment it begins.